Book of Esther. Use one of the books, the Bibles in the pew, or you can follow along on the screen here in just a few minutes. We've got some verses that I put up there. This morning, we are continuing to look at Esther's story. We started looking at that last week, and I'm not sure exactly how long we're going to be in Esther's story. My original sermon plan was to be there for about 2 or 3 weeks, and the Lord has been dealing with me in regard to staying in the story of Esther, because I've been discovering some things myself that I've shared with you many times. I've been doing this for a long time, and it's exciting to me. It thrills my soul when I look into the Scripture and I see something, I begin to understand something, or even with this morning's message, I recognize a character in the Bible that I had never heard of, or never read before, or never studied, or never paid attention to. And so we're going to stay in Esther for a little while. Next Sunday is Father's Day. I want you to plan on being here for Father's Day. We've got a very special treat for you next Sunday. I'm sure you'll be blessed. But this morning, I want to continue to look at Esther, at her story just a little bit. Last week, I spent some time just kind of introducing the 4 main people in the book. There are several people mentioned, but there are 4, the stars of the show, if you will. Esther, of course, is a young Jewish woman who's been taken captive and held originally in Babylon, and then when the Medes and the Persians overthrew Babylon, then she became the captive of the Medes and Persians. Then there was her cousin, Mordecai. Mordecai was an older gentleman who had raised Esther from when she was a child, and to the point in the story where she is an adult. Then there's King Ahasuerus, who is the king of Persia and rules over 127 provinces. And then there is in the story a corrupt government official. Now, stay with me. This is a true story. It's not fiction. I know you would never believe there's such a thing as a corrupt government official. Anyhow, his name is Haman, and we'll get to him in a few weeks. Esther, of course, as I said, was a captive Jewish girl who, by the sovereignty of God, would become the queen of all Persia. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The book of Esther is named for her specifically, but it doesn't really start with Esther. It starts in the king's palace, actually with another woman's story, the wife of King Ahasuerus, the current queen of Persia, and her name was Vashti. We're in chapter 1 of the book of Esther this morning. Queen Vashti. I have to admit and get excited about the fact that until the Lord started dealing with me about doing a series of sermons from Esther, I had never paid attention to this woman. In fact, when I first read her name, I stopped and thought, had I ever heard of her before? I don't remember her in Sunday school. I don't remember hearing any of the evangelists or camp meeting preachers, or most of you are aware, my dad was a pastor for 50 years. I don't remember ever hearing him preach about it. Of course, as a child and teenager, I don't remember much of what he preached anyhow. But Queen Vashti. Most people have never heard of her. And it is easy to overlook her in this greater story of Esther. But I believe she brings something very important and significant to us. And so I want to spend a little time looking at Queen Vashti's story in chapter 1 this morning. as I was studying, doing research, I've read a lot of the early church fathers, some of the biblical scholars and historians trying to discover some things about this queen of Persia, who ruled actually a very short time, probably about 3.5 years, that she ruled as queen of Persia. And I came across a particular scholar who I found her writing to be very insightful and very interesting. Her name is Dr. Anna Carter Florence. And her thoughts inspired this message dealing with Vashti today, because I was tempted to do like a lot of scholars and preachers and historians have done and just jump to chapter 2 and start talking about Esther. But I couldn't get away from chapter 1, and I wanted to give it due justice. And so in her writings, Dr. Florence refers to Queen Vashti's role as a dangerous memory for the people of Persia, for the Jewish nation, and a dangerous memory even within the life of the church. Now, what does she mean by that? It means exactly what it sounds like. Dangerous memories are the things that really happen that are too damaging or too racy or too embarrassing to remember and to tell in polite company. You know, there's a lot of stories in the Bible that if I'd been writing it, I've always said I don't think I'd have told that story. And this is one of those that becomes a dangerous or a disturbing memory. But what I've discovered so many times is that sometimes memories stop being dangerous or stop being disturbing when we get them out in the open and learn from them. Now, the church, just like any other family, sometimes the church has its stories that are disturbing memories as well. So sometimes the church has gone to great lengths to take some of those stories that we might not tell out of circulation. And that's why I believe we haven't heard much about Queen Vashti in Sunday school or Vacation Bible School or in preacher sermons. Now, when I discover someone like her, and for me personally, I don't know if this will excite you or not, or if you get excited, but most of you are aware I'm an old newspaper man. And so when it seems like something's being covered up or something's being hidden, man, that lights my fire. I want to dig into that. I want to find out. It's an invitation to turn on the searchlights and to dig into it. And so this morning I wanted to just share with you some of the things that I've discovered about Queen Vashti. I want us to ask the question this morning, what is so disturbing about her to cause her story to be disregarded so much in history and in church history? After all, the writer of the book of Esther thought this was important enough to start the book with. This is one of those biblical stories that very easily could have been left out, and the story of Esther would have still been just as challenging and just as inspirational. So the writer of the book thought it was important enough to tell. She's in the Bible, and so we've got to figure out why we haven't heard more about her. Queen Vashti makes her one and only biblical appearance in chapter 1 of the book of Esther. This chapter tells us, gives us some insight into the king, Ahasuerus, and his thinking, his role as king. Chapter 1 tells the story how he decided to, about 3 years into his rule, he decided to throw a party. And this is not just a casual evening with friends. This was a party that he invited all of his officials, his governors, his soldiers, his princes, everyone from all of his provinces to come to the palace and to party. There was no real agenda, no real theme to the party except to gorge themselves on the finest foods the king could offer and to drink the finest wine that the Persian kingdom could ever produce. the king's only goal in throwing this party was to impress his servants, the people who lived under his rule. His only goal was to use his wealth and power to impress them. To say, look how wealthy I am. Look how glorious my palace is. And to boost his ego to the point of impressing them. The Bible tells us in chapter 1 that it took about 6 months to throw this party. Now, I don't know about you, but after I throw a party, I'm done about 9, 10 o'clock. You know, 6 months. Actually, it tells us it was a total of 187 days that they partied. They drank, they ate, they laid around, they slept it off, then they started eating and drinking again. The text tells us in verse 7 that the drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. As long as he could afford it, and he could, they continued to just pour the wine. In fact, near the end of his big party that he thought, the last 7 days, he said, this party isn't big enough. So he invited everybody from the city. Not only his princes and servants and soldiers, but everybody from the city was invited for the last 7 days of the party. Now this is a king, if we look at this is a king who has his priorities really messed up. Makes you wonder what the people in the provinces were doing while their government leaders were at the palace getting drunk and partying. How long could you go without a simple government? How long could you go without the military? For 6 months? You know, it causes a lot of disturbance, a lot of questions. Instead of being a king who chooses to do the right and honorable thing, he allows his ego to get the best of him and makes some pretty terrible decisions. And one of those terrible decisions focuses on Queen Vashti. Get the picture here. The king wanted these men who had spent 6 months eating his food and drinking his wine to be impressed even more so by flaunting what he considered his greatest possession. He had shown them the palace and all of the gold and the finery and the wealth and the all that he had. But his greatest possession now in the last days of the party, he said, I want you to see the best thing. I want you to see the most beautiful thing. His wife, Queen Vashti, the queen of Persia. Now we have to put ourselves in that setting. In that day, no one was allowed to approach or even look at the king's wife, at the queen, without the proper protocol and respect. And there were just certain rules you had to abide by to even see the queen, let alone have an audience to speak with her. So the king tells us in verse 10, chapter 1, verse 10, and forgive me for butchering the names. Just know that it's coming. Verse 10, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. Now, let me interpret that. He was drunk as a skunk. Okay? He was merry with wine. He commanded Mehumam, Biztha, Harbana, Bigtha, and Agatha, Zethar, and Carcass. I practiced those. And the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the people and the princes her beauty, because she was lovely to look at. Now, in 2018, we read that line and we think that's not such a big deal, is it? I mean, there's been several times when I've been preaching in a new place, or when I was traveling in evangelism for the state ministry, that they would introduce me, and then I would do the courtesy of introducing Lisa and ask her to stand up and let them see you, so you know who you are. Sometimes I say, stand up, let them see how pretty you are. And so I thought about that, and then I thought about the king's request, and I thought, this doesn't seem like a big deal. Doesn't seem like a horrible idea. But as I looked into the history, and as I read the Bible scholars and the commentaries, many of the scholars that I've studied believed that the command, read that last part again, bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown. There's something missing in that statement. Most of the scholars believe that what he had commanded, the royal commandment, when he said to come in your royal crown, basically he wanted Vashti to come to the party wearing only her royal crown and nothing much else. He wanted to parade her in front of them to make those men lust and jealous over the beauty and the figure. It says she was lovely to look at. Most of the time, if you stop and think about it, if you see the queen or some of the duchesses today, you look at that crown, and most people, their attention is drawn to the crown. And you talk about, what does she look like? Well, the crown was beautiful. But if Queen Vashti came wearing only the crown, you might talk about something else. You see, when he ordered that she should come in her royal crown, if he were ordering it correctly, he would have said, bring her in her royal garments. Bring her in her robe and crown. But instead, he left off the clothes. That leads us then to the dangerous memory, to the disturbing part of the story. Verse 12 gives the highlight of Queen Vashti's story. But the Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. She ticked him off by saying, no. Queen Vashti refused the king's command to come to be paraded in front of these drunken men, and she would not surrender her dignity or her pride that easily. And the other women that were gathered in the palace that day, although frightened by this, probably would have applauded the queen's decision. See, Queen Vashti is, from what I can tell in Scripture, the first woman to be on record to just say no. No, I will not come out and make a display of myself for your benefit. No, I will not degrade myself so you can save face in front of your friends. I won't do it. Especially when you've been drunk for 187 days. Give me a break. Vashti is cutting really new ground here for the biblical story, for the cultural story of that day. No, she said, I am more than a cheap thrill. I am more than a decorative display. I'm a human being with integrity and self-respect. I am the queen of Persia. And more than that, I am your wife. And I draw the line. No. That was unheard of. Absolutely unheard of. The women in that day, in that time, could not refuse the men. And here, this was the king. King Ahasuerus is told no by his own queen, and the king's reaction is predictable. He is enraged, and he's humiliated in front of all of the men of his kingdom. So in order to save face and to make a point, the king got together with his officials, said, what are we going to do about this? And they said, let's just kick her out. Let's kick her out. They decide, away with Vashti and away with any woman who fails to do as her husband commands. They made it a law in Persia. Then they said, let another queen be chosen to take Vashti's place, and let Vashti's memory die with her. Now, I do have a point. Here's part of the point for today. In the Christian faith today, we tend to think of the Christian faith in terms of saying yes. I want you to say yes to God's grace, yes to Jesus Christ and his pardon, yes to love and mercy and grace. Say yes to his appeal, to his call. But I think sometimes, and I'm staking my ground today, that it is equally important in our life for Christians to find the courage sometimes to say no when it's needed. Not because it's an easy thing to do, it isn't. But because it's the right thing to do. You see, on one level, the men are successful. Vashti disappears from any other biblical record. And even today, the history records and portrays Vashti as a mean-spirited and angry woman. Now, who would write such a thing? King Ashura and his historians. History records it this way because it was the king and his historians who wrote the history. And it's pretty easy to discover why they would remember her in ways that are less than flattering. But, despite the king's best efforts, the story of Vashti is not erased. That her great no, the echo of her great no is reverberating throughout history. She lives on in the minds of her people. She lived on in the minds of the king, I'm sure. And most importantly, I believe she lived on in the mind of Queen Esther when she would be brought up to be the new queen after Vashti is disposed. In many ways, I believe Esther actually finishes what Vashti started. Together, their story is not a dangerous memory, but it's a sacred memory for the life of the church. And how the voice of a woman or any oppressed people can overturn a nation, can overturn a world by saying no when it's important to do so. See, I think sometimes we miss the point, especially those who would disregard and disavow the story of Vashti. See, this is an amazing story. The king demands that she do something unthinkable and humiliating. Something that violates the marriage covenant. And so it raises questions. Are we supposed to obey things that compromise our integrity? That brings it right home to today. Is this what we are to teach our daughters and our sons? See, this is a story about more than just a spat between a husband and a wife. And it's not just a story for a woman who's looking for a reason to rebel. This is a story for every person who has ever felt their integrity called into question. For every person who has ever had to weigh the risks between a job and self-respect. Who has ever had to stand up in the face of an unjust situation. And I believe it's time for the church to quit jumping past this part of the story of Esther and give Queen Vashti her place and her voice. We need this story for our children to have role models that teach the lesson of saying no. Saying no to adults who would try to molest or to harm them. This story would help us for our daughters and granddaughters to muster the courage to say no to a boyfriend who keeps pressuring them for sex when they don't want to give in. Vashti's story gives us a place to begin talking about the hundreds of awkward, troubling moments in our lives when we feel like we're being asked to do something that puts our integrity on the line. The boss tells us to hide money in a fake expense account, or a friend that at a party offers drugs that we don't want, or illicit relationships that are ungodly. Or a family member assumes that we'll keep ignoring the addiction that is ruining their lives and damaging our lives. Things can and do happen every day to challenge our integrity. What do? Do we say no? It isn't easy, but it's right to do so. We've got to look at the story of Vashti, quite honestly. She does not win the day. Oh, that'd be a great story, wouldn't it? Queen Vashti said no, and the people of the palace applauded her and put the king in his place. And that's not what happens. In the eyes of the world, Vashti is a loser in this because they take away her crown. They take away her position. They take away her prestige. They take away her good name. In the eyes of the world, when Vashti said no, she gets exiled and inspires this terrible law in the Persians that women cannot refuse men any demand. But in God's eyes, in the eyes of our Heavenly Father, is something far different. Vashti's courage inspires the next woman, who is Esther. And Esther's story inspires the next woman, and the next woman, and the next woman, and inspires each of the women and the men in this room today. The last chapter, or the last part of chapter 1, describes a call for young virgins to be brought to the palace to compete for the queen's title. And eventually, one of them, this little captive girl named Esther, is chosen. She hides the fact that she's Jewish. But she becomes crowned the new queen of Persia. And we'll pick up at that point when we come back to Esther Sunday after next, after Father's Day. I believe Vashti's great no becomes Esther's great no. No, it's not right to murder a whole race of people, which is the challenge of Esther. Vashti's example encourages men and women not to be afraid to speak up for themselves when integrity is on the line. Vashti sets something in motion that Esther remembered, the king remembered, the writers of the Bible remembered, and you and I need to remember today. See, I think our world is waiting for a Queen Vashti. Waiting for a person who has the courage to say no to something that isn't right. Maybe we can meet some. Maybe it's you. Maybe you are one of them. Maybe you have been sent to the kingdom for such a time as this, as Esther was. God's grace is enough. It can give you the strength and the courage you need to say no when your integrity is challenged. One last point I want to bring to us today. As impressive as Vashti was, as a Persian queen, she did not know the God of creation. She did not know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She was Persian. She was pagan. And the Persian culture worshipped many gods, false gods, pagan gods. She lived in a pagan culture ruled by ungodly men. I believe she drew on the inborn knowledge of God. Remember, Paul says in Romans chapter 1 that there is born within us the knowledge of good and evil, right and wrong, love and hate. That's just part of it. Every person who is created in the image of God has that inborn knowledge. Some call it conscience, some call it judgment, some call it many different things. But I believe she drew on that God had instilled within her as one of his creation. But here's the difference today. Today, we have access to what Vashti didn't. We have the knowledge of Jesus Christ and the presence of his Holy Spirit to guide us. We have the Word of God to inspire and direct our paths. We have the grace of God that was, is, and forevermore shall be greater than our sin. So I think Vashti's story tells us if she can do it, so can I. So can you. His grace really is enough to even say no.
Hi, this is Pastor Don from Waters Edge Church here in Cape Coral, Florida. Thank you for stopping by our YouTube channel to listen in to our Sunday morning preaching services. If you want more information about us, I invite you to check out our webpage at mywatersedgechurch.com, or you can check our Facebook page. Just search for Waters Edge Church, Cape Coral, Florida. Or better yet, I would love to meet you in person. We gather every Sunday morning at 10:30 for a time of inspirational worship and biblically based preaching. We would love to meet you, and we've got a seat here reserved just for you. Hope to see you soon. God bless.